You're listening to the Soil Sisters podcast, where we dig in on family farming and ranching, regenerative agriculture, healthy living, and planting seeds in our community. We invite you to listen, subscribe, and grow with the Soil Sisters. Hi, y'all. I'm Joanna Newting, joined by my blood, soul, and soil sister, Crystal. Welcome to the show.
I'm so happy to be here today, sister, and I'm excited for the information that we are about to get from our fantastic guest.
Yes, me too. We are welcoming Matt Simon to the podcast. He is the farm director at the Refugee Collective Farm in Elgin, Texas. He has been managing certified organic farms since 2017 and is a leader in Central Texas regenerative agriculture, as exemplified in the Refugee Collective's Resilient Farm Plan, the first of its kind in Texas. We are very excited to dig into all things carbon farm planning, resilient farm planning, as we've rebranded here in Texas. Matt Simon, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. I feel like I've been in y'all's orbit for quite a while now, so it's good to finally connect and really sit down to talk about all the work that we're doing out at the Refugee Collective.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. We got to visit the Refugee Collective Farm a couple of years back, and it's really beautiful what you're doing there. So I'd love to start the conversation with you telling us the maybe Cliff's Notes origin story of the Refugee Collective Farm.
The Refugee Collective itself is a nonprofit whose mission is to provide livelihood opportunities for refugees. And we do that both through the farm, which is a certified organic 20-acre farm in Elgin. And we also have a sustainable textile studio that operates at a Central Presbyterian Church in downtown Austin. And as far as the farm is concerned, the lease that we hold, we've had since 2018. And the land has an interesting backstory. It's actually a conservation easement that the landowner, John Beal, worked with Travis County and some other landowners to start the Wilbarger Creek Conservation Alliance. And so we lease 20 acres that are a part of his broader 300 acres. And then that 300 acres is part of a broader 2,000 contiguous acres all along the creeks out here, Wilbarger Creek and Willow Creek and others. And that's one really unique aspect of the farm is that John, with all of his conservation goals, has really supported us with all of our regenerative farming goals. There's a couple of other organic farming operations who operate out here on his land as well. So I'm really excited to see that partnership between conservation easement landowners and organic farms kind of flourish in the future, because I think it's really important as land access becomes more and more difficult for people trying to get into farming. As far as the farm itself goes, we're fully certified organic, both with vegetables and eggs. And I'll kind of get into a little bit later how we incorporate the chickens into our cropping system. The main way that we sell our produce is through CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, and we deliver about 100 boxes every single week to areas around Austin that have 7 to 9 items in each box. And then we also do a fair amount of wholesale to restaurants and a few wholesale partners, different small scale grocery stores and things like that. We've also gotten into doing a lot of refugee food access over the past few years, with some grant funding, both from Travis County as well as through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so we also have a community farmer program where we teach refugees regenerative agriculture methods, and they use those skills to grow food for their own family. And they also have the opportunity to sell some of that produce to our buyers, and we kind of foster the communication there to earn a supplemental income from what they're growing as well. So really trying to tell the story of not only providing year-round employment for a team of refugees, but also kind of opening the doors for the broader refugee community to grow the food that best nourishes their own communities while making some money on the side as well.
That's outstanding. And I remember when we were out there that they're growing foods that they're used to eating. They're cultural foods that they want. And you know what, when you're living far away from home, it's nice to have, the comfort food that
Mhm.
soothes your soul. So I really love that about the Refugee Collective.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's been, a really interesting initiative because, most of the times food access means kind of like sort of gleaning the leftovers from the industrial food supply, and then that's what ends up getting distributed to a lot of people, which most of the time is not really like health promoting foods, and I've had conversations with some of the people who have worked out here saying like, oh, when I got to America, it was so easy to just go to the store and buy like a soda and some chips, and I couldn't do that back home. And but they noticed that within the refugee community, there's a higher prevalence of hypertension, diabetes, different things. And I think it is just like you mentioned, that there's really not access to those traditional foods that are really a part of the culture of where folks are coming from. So to be able to provide them the opportunity to grow those crops that they've been eating their entire lives in their new homes has been really powerful.
I love that. And being able to share that with the wider community, the different varieties and maybe recipes and things that we just don't have any idea about. We grew up in the country and I love that. But, onion and garlic is our seasoning, maybe some cumin or some kind of pepper. But Dion and I are talking about what we're going to cook later, and it's going to have ginger and garlic and cumin and all kinds of different flavors and sweet potato and vegetables in it. And these are things that they're used to using all the time. And so much of America, we're having food like substances. So I am encouraged that they're able to share their culinary knowledge and the vegetables and, healthy foods that they eat in their homeland.
Yeah, and we've been doing more and more like value added products as well. We have a food processing trailer out here on site, and so we actually have seasoning blends that our refugee staff developed the recipes for. So there's one that represents each country. So we have an Afghan one, a Syrian one, West African, Southeast Asian as well, and just really unique flavors that have a lot of like different uses. And yeah, we've been getting those out through the CSA, and they're also at a couple like small grocers in Austin as well. So that's really, what we're trying to do is kind of allow our staff a place to tell their own story with the foods that they've always grown up with.
So you developed the very first resilient farm plan in Texas here on the Refugee Collective Farm. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like practically, what a resilient farm plan is, and then we can kind of dive into the nuance. And also you let me know when you're like, this is a great time to pull up those slides that I sent you.
Yeah, so I think slide number 4 would probably be where the sort of beginning of the resilient farm planning. Just to give a little bit of backstory to how we even became aware of this work, Meg, our CEO, went to an eco farm conference. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that. Really, I've never gotten to go. I'm kind of jealous, but there's this incredible farming conference in California. I think a lot of times they'll hold it in like Big Sur or Monterey or something. So it sounds lovely, but
somewhere beautiful.
Yeah. So she went to, I guess there was sort of like a breakout group for women in regenerative agriculture, and she met a woman there who's involved with Carbon Cycle Institute. And they're a Marin County, so Bay Area of California based organization that developed this framework known as the Carbon Farm Planning Framework. And essentially what it is a way to look at the entire farm. So, we lease 20 acres out here, but we actually only crop about 4 of those with annuals, because there's weird topography and some areas are kind of wooded and some areas the soil is just, particularly bad. And so it's sort of like in the past, we would just keep that mode or maybe plant some trees, but not really with any sort of like design in mind. And so the carbon farm planning process takes a look at the entire farm, even those niches that aren't really in production, and looks at it through the lens of carbon sequestration. So the idea is, what biology can we introduce into the farming ecosystem to really create the most dynamic carbon sequestering system possible? Essentially what the process is to take a look at the map of the farm, identify, what areas are best for annual agriculture, and really dial in different regenerative practices on the annual fields, and then also take a step out from the annual fields and say, what if there was a windbreak of trees and other shrubs along this fence line, and then once those trees are mature, how could the lumber harvested from them, branches harvested from them, make their way into the farm's composting operation? And so really looking at different ways to cycle carbon on the land. And the plans typically have like a pretty long time horizon. So a typical plan, because there's so many perennials involved, both trees as well as conservation cover, like perennial grasses and forbs and those sorts of things, they typically say, the time horizon for fully implementing one of these plans and have it be at, running full stop is about 20 years. And also within that 20-year time span, obviously, management capabilities and needs and production potential is going to change. So it's a living document as well. And one of the cool things is that once you kind of identify what practices can fit in where, Colorado State University developed this program called Comet Farm Planner. And I believe it's open source and anyone can just go to Comet Farm Planner if you search it. And even with your backyard, if you have a quarter acre, you can dial in different practices that you might want to implement, like planting, conservation cover or planting trees. And it'll actually quantify how much carbon sequestration potential there is from implementing that practice. And all of those practices, or the vast majority of them, I would say almost all of them, are related to USDA NRCS, which is Natural Resource Conservation Service. So a branch of the USDA that deals with soil conservation, water conservation, those sorts of things. And they have what are called CPS codes, which are conservation practice standard codes, which is essentially like what's sort of the gold standard way and best practices on implementing no-till, on implementing cover crop, those sorts of things. And so those codes are also referenced both in the plan as well as in the Comet Farm Planner. And essentially at the end of the day, once you have that map drawn up and enter in the Comet Farm Planner, it spits out what the total carbon sequestration potential is for your entire farm.
So what you've just said, we're like, okay, we want to do what's right. We want to build healthy soil. So through this resilient farm plan or carbon farm planning, we've created this framework. Like, what is this land capable of? What are we wanting to do? I guess I want to pull up your next slide. That's like, why? Why do we, why do we care about this stuff? Just in real practical terms, why is this so important?
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning too, our plan is branded as Texas' first resilient farm plan. And there's a reason for that. So we worked with Carbon Cycle Institute to develop our plan. And we also worked with National Center for Appropriate Technology. And they're a Texas-based, branch of National Center for Appropriate Technology. So they were really trying to push the carbon farm planning framework forward in Texas. And they were kind of, receiving two sort of obstacles. One was in the political climate in Texas, talking about climate change and talking about, carbon sequestration for the purpose of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere to slow climate change is kind of politically charged, whereas in California, there's less pushback on that narrative, and that's a whole other topic that we could go into. But essentially, there's that issue, and then also I think people started to think like, oh, carbon farming, like, does that have to do with carbon credits? Does it have to do with like the carbon markets, And so just from the outset, I want to say like, that is not a part of it. The science behind really quantifying carbon capture through agriculture is improving, but, it still has a long ways to go. And so the carbon farm planning process and the resilient farm planning process are really a lot more about implementing these practices in order to, draw down as much carbon as possible, but not to monetize it necessarily. So just wanted to say that is not why carbon farm planning.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because that's what I'm like, is this that carbon credit game? I feel like they're gamifying it for big companies. And when we went out to your farm and we were learning about this, I'm like, oh, this is the real thing. This is like actually capturing carbon and doing what's right, not about the gamified system that is big agriculture.
Well, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what it is. It's gamified big ag. And on the other hand, the reason that we're doing all this stuff is their other hand in the big chemical that is literally causing us to lose all this carbon from our soil and to kill our microbiology and to kill all the other stuff that's going to support drawing down that carbon. So they're like making money on the carbon game and they're making money on the chemical game. So I love that. Yeah, let's leave all those out of the equation and let's just do what's right and support life in the soil, in the plant, in the animal, in the human, in the land, in the community, in our families, like supporting life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more that you sort of are in the agricultural sector and the agricultural sphere, the more your sort of greenwashing detector kind of like gets fine-tuned. And and I feel like I'm not an expert by any means, but a lot of what I see in the sort of carbon market space is a lot of that greenwashing and ways for corporations to kind of pass the buck and really not take on responsibility for cutting their own emissions or improving their own technologies. And I just don't think it's the most effective way to approach the problem we have like at scale, because, it allows these corporations to sort of put a shiny image on what they're doing without actually making deep changes because they have deep enough pockets to buy these carbon credits, So, I mean, that's a pretty like simplified view, but I also think it's like on the surface, that's kind of what's going on,
100%.
Yes.
And when you really dig into what you're talking about with the carbon farm planning, it really is just practicing regenerative agriculture, but doing it in a way where you're creating a long-term framework for it instead of, okay, I'm just going to make the next right decision. It's, okay, let's sit down and look at this and what do we want to see on this land in 20 years?
Well, I feel like it helps quantify and it helps people see a picture of what we just know. Like this helps other people like wrap their mind around it and see it in terms of, numbers in some way that helps them get it. So whatever it takes.
And I think that's the power of the way, I think that element of it has allowed it to develop the way that it has in California. They're over a decade into this work out there. And actually, Lynette from Carbon Cycle Institute will be at the field day that we'll talk about a little bit later on November 3rd to kind of give some of the historical background about how it's developed in California. But, there's hundreds of plans on tens of thousands of acres now out there that have this framework on it. And I think without that quantifiable component, it takes a lot of different stakeholders with a lot of different interests and a lot of different levers to pull in order to move the needle on this sort of big of a project. To have, that many farms and that many acres within this framework is like kind of incredible. And I think without that quantifiable component to show people like, this isn't just like me saying like, oh, I'm going to like plant a cover crop once or twice or whatever, that there is this very like strategic, quantified sort of process that you're taking on and that your farm is going through, working toward that carbon sequestration goal, there's just a lot of power in that. And even, policymakers, farmers, kind of everyone in the whole conversation, it's something they can like very easily connect with, so yeah, I think that feature of it is really powerful. Yeah.
And I love what you're saying, because it takes community. We all have to do our part in our lane. Like, this is what we're doing, that's what you're doing, that's what they're doing, but we're all doing it in the same way. And so that is how we build this and make this a real thing that actually moves the numbers and moves the levers that need to be moved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you're creating this framework for your farm, are you also from the beginning setting up, these are the timeframes where we're doing testing, and what are you looking at? What soil tests and what in ecosystem testing are you doing within a resilient farm plan?
Yeah, that aspect of it is important as well, because the planning portion uses the Common Farm Planner software, but that's really just modeled CO2. So essentially, without spending currently like hundreds of thousands of dollars to really monitor carbon in an effective way over a vast, farming landscape, the proxy for carbon in soil is soil organic matter. So every soil test, pretty much every soil test, it's standard to be testing for soil organic matter. And soil organic matter is about 50%. I think it's, they say like 46 or whatever, but I usually just say 50% carbon is essentially what is being measured in that soil test. Instead of trying to really dial in, like, exactly how many carbon molecules are in this teaspoon of soil, really what we do is we test once a year, usually in the fall. That's kind of when nutrients are on their way to being a little less active. So October, November. And so we measure every year around that time, so that's kind of the best time where the soil is still dynamic. It's not fully asleep, but it's also not just like, rapidly cycling its nutrients like it does in the spring and in the summer. And so we'll test during that time. And the whole idea is that year over year, we want to see an increase in that soil organic matter percentage. A lot of industrial heavy tillage farms are lucky to even have like 0.5% soil organic matter. It's pretty dismal. I think pre-industrial agricultural numbers are usually said to be somewhere around like 2.5 to 3% soil organic matter. And so really what we're trying to do is the 20-year goal for us with our soil type, which is really heavy clay. If we were to be able to get it up to 6% soil organic matter, that would be impressive, so that's really kind of what we're working toward. And we missed our soil test last year, but again, at the field day that we're doing in November, part of it is going to be a soil testing demo by Dr. Provin from Prairie View A&M. And so we'll get our new soil tests, and everyone else will be able to see what that process is like. And we're 2 years now into our implementation of all the annual practices, which we can talk about the actual practices in a second, because that's a really interesting aspect of it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see, compared to the 2 year ago baseline, where we're at now after having implemented all these practices.
So what is the baseline?
Start with?
Yeah.
I'd have to look back, but I want to say that we were somewhere around like 1.8 or 2% in most of the fields. Our fields are very different soil types and different states of, like, some of them were leased to cattle a really long time ago and are kind of overgrazed, and we've really, it's taken a lot to even be able to grow like arugula in them. And then some other areas have been, a little more amenable to planting. So yeah, but I think, we took like 4 different samples from different areas of the farm, and I want to say most of them were, around like high 1s, low 2s, like somewhere in that range. So
wow,
definitely
percent.
like,
Yes.
What's that?
Percent.
Yeah,
2%.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we started. Go, sis.
0.1%
Oh my.
organic matter in our on our
And
30
what
acres.
had taken place on that land prior to y'all
It's
measuring?
been farmed conventionally for 100
farmed for wheat, hay grazer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sandy loam and 0.1%. This is.
We were like, well, we've got nowhere to go but up.
That's right.
It's true. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think I've heard also that sandy soil in particular, it's hard to get it to retain that soil organic matter as well. Compared to clay soils and stuff. So sounds like you'll have your work cut out for you, but you also know what you're doing. So
we're on our way. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Which slide should I pop up on the screen?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and do the one that kind of deals with the practices. So I think that would be number 6. Yeah, that one. So this is really kind of what I like to impress on people, because I feel like everyone kind of knows what organic agriculture is at this point because they see it in the grocery stores. And I think even if they're not familiar with the practices, basically what it means to them is no chemicals were used in making this product, So when I think about regenerative agriculture, I farmed as a standard organic farmer for the first, 5 years of my farming career. And so, there are sort of standard practices that your organic certifier is going to want to see that you're implementing. So those include things like crop rotation, not planting the same thing in the same place year after year, because that depletes the nutrients and you also get pest and disease buildup. So kind of rotating what plant families you're putting in a given place, cover cropping, which, in industrial agriculture, we're dumping chemical fertilizers on the soil season after season. But in organic agriculture, we don't have that. I was going to say luxury, but it's really not a luxury, but we don't do that. So you have to give the soil time to rest in between planting. And in order to restore some of the fertility that was taken out from your last cash crop, we plant a cover crop. And, there's different cover crop mixes that we use in different seasons. We actually just got in the ground our fall cover crop. We're actually irrigating it because apparently it's never going to rain again in Central Texas. But so for the fall, we usually do like oats and peas and vetch and daikon radish and also some purple top turnips. And so the oats are really to kind of stimulate, add a lot of biomass to the soil once we're terminating the cover crop. And then the legumes like the vetch and the peas are both nitrogen fixers. That's kind of one of the incredible things about legumes is the nitrogen is a really essential building block for plant health. And when you're extracting that out, you have to put it back somehow. And luckily, biologically, beans and vetch, which is another legume, restore that to the soil. And then the daikon radish we put in there this time of year because it has a really long taproot. And we won't even usually harvest that unless we're like desperate for some reason and actually sell it. But having that long taproot will help nutrients from further down in the soil cycle upward to higher stratums, or whatever you want to say, in the soil layers, so that when you do plant your next cash crop, more of those nutrients from further down will be more available to the plants that you're going to plant after the cover crop. And again, both of these practices I consider just like standard organic agriculture. And then, we're also applying compost in organic agriculture, adding, broken down organic matter that usually has some amount of biological life kind of going on. And then within that compost, a lot of times you might mix in different micronutrients that are necessary for your soil based on soil tests. So, that might be things like phosphorus if you're really, deficient in phosphorus. We use a lot of elemental sulfur out here because another obstacle of ours is the pH out here is really high. Typically, they say, anything above like a 8.2, that soil is so basic that nutrients really don't even want to like move in that kind of environment. And, we're at about like an 8 in some of our fields. And really you want it to be at maybe like 6.5, mid 6s, somewhere in that range for vegetable farming. So yeah, applying those new micronutrients and different amendments to try to tweak the soil for your specific needs is another approach that I consider standard organic farming.
2 things that I want to make sure that you touch on, and in whatever order and however you want to, but developing that crop rotation strategy that you're talking about of not doing the same thing, like how are you figuring out what that strategy is? And then also, how are y'all creating farm scale compost?
Totally. So I think as far as, our rotation goes, that kind of leads nicely into sort of the regenerative elements. So, we just talked about organic elements, and then some of the regenerative elements that we incorporate that not a lot of other farms do is our use of chickens in the cropping system. And without the chickens in it, I think our cropping system would be kind of a lot more similar to what other people's crop rotation might be. So typically, you might want to do a pretty low feeding crop. So something like arugula or radishes or lettuces, something that doesn't require a lot of nutrients. And then you would do maybe a higher feeding crop from a different plant family after that. So maybe you would plant tomatoes after those things that I just mentioned. And your tomatoes are going to be in there, for 120 days. So they're really heavy feeders. And then on the back end of the tomatoes, as you're heading into like the fall season, is usually what comes after you have had tomatoes in the ground, you might either do another kind of lower feeding crop. You might be able to get away with some kale or something, but definitely from a different plant family. Tomatoes are from the Solanaceae plant family, and then kale is from the Brassica family. And lettuce would have been from like the Asteraceae family. So, 3 different plant families kind of moving through the season. And, one light feeder, one really heavy feeder, maybe another light feeder. But even on the back end of that heavy feeder, you might go ahead and put a cover crop in. And then you would have an entire season where the cover crop is there restoring the soil nutrients before you move into your next cash crop. So with the chickens in the mix, kind of the way that we incorporate them is we would do that whole sequence that I just mentioned. And then when the cover crop reached maturity, which for most cover crops is going to be like 60 to 65 days, we would actually move the chickens onto the cover crop. And so the chickens would do the cover crop termination for us. And just from being on there, we leave them in one like 50 by 100 foot area for about a month. And then, so 5,000 square feet. And then, when they move off, that whole area is like fully defoliated by then, basically, and I wouldn't call it rotational grazing. And we actually don't call it that anymore, because we had some people come out and they're like, that's not what y'all are doing. Y'all are terminating your cover crop with chickens and doing weed control with chickens. So, even though we have animals in the system, I would not call it rotational grazing, where you're typically trying to like improve the plants that are there, not like destroy them. But we'll have those chickens on there, and then we'll either do another cover crop, or sometimes we'll tarp where we had the chickens and then wait until we're ready to do a cash crop if there's not enough time to really do another cover crop. And I guess.
And by tarping, do you mean just laying it down, killing anything that's under it?
Yeah, these giant
Just like,
silage tarps.
okay.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so those are really, those are kind of a lot more in use these days. And a big reason for that is, going back to the typical organic agricultural model, usually people would come in and instead of terminating that cover crop with chickens, they would come in and mow that cover crop. And then they would disc that in, plow that into the soil. And then that's how that would get incorporated into the soil. The microorganisms in the soil would eat the decaying plant matter. And, that's kind of standard organic agricultural practice. But, we'll move the chickens on it. And then either, we'll have this kind of blank slate. We didn't have to disc to get that blank slate. We use the chickens to do that termination. And then if we're going to do another cover crop, if it were standard organic agriculture, usually if you were just going to follow, do one cover crop and then another cover crop, you would disc again and then seed the cover crop into the disced up ground and then kind of do a light disc to harrow everything in. So, that's one thing I think people need to realize is that standard organic agriculture is actually like pretty heavy tillage at the end of the day. A lot of times even more so than industrial agriculture, because again, since you're not using any chemical weed control, your main way to control weeds is to just go in and plow up the ground again and again and again with each flush of weeds, So I've been on a lot of larger scale organic farms, and I think people have this idea in their head of organic as like, oh, it's going to be this verdant thing. And, but I mean, I've been on some large organic farms that feel like a moonscape, I mean, it doesn't feel like an intact ecosystem because, the way they can deal with weed pressure, is by disking. So we'll put in, and the way they cover crop is also by disking. So once we have that tarp on and we pull it off, we're left with a pretty blank slate. And if we want to do another cover crop, and this kind of gets into the next practice that I consider regenerative, which is no-till. If we want to use another cover crop, we have a no-till drill, and we'll put that on the back of the tractor, and that will basically cut slits in each of the beds that have already been established from the previous crop. And it'll cut a slit into the beds. Ours has 5 different chutes. And so all of those slits will have seed that gets dropped down out of the seed box on the drill. And then the wheels come behind and cover that over. And so because we don't have to disc in order to cover crop anymore, we're essentially working on permanent beds. So we did disc like 2.5 years ago, and we used a machine to shape the beds and everything. But ever since then, we actually haven't disked at all since then. And we have, these blocks of beds that are essentially going to be there, hopefully forever. And so the way that we plant into that, because if you think about it, whenever you plant a plant, you kind of need the soil to be loose enough to like get it in there. And if it's not that way, then you're going to have to like really dig and kind of, go crazy. So the way that we approach that is that you have this permanent bed, and we have a compost spreader that spreads a 1/2 inch with each pass. And so we'll come through and do anywhere between 2 and 4 passes, just kind of depending on, again, how heavy of a feeder, whatever we're going to plant there is. And so we'll do minimum 1 inch thickness of compost and sometimes 2 inches of compost on that permanent bed. And that gives you enough material to work with to cover the plants over and actually plant.
Do you do that before you do your no-till seed drill, or after the no-till seed drill where you lay a blanket over those seeds you just planted?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically
what comes first?
Yeah, the no-till seed drill would do the cover crop, and then it would usually be about 2 months until it's ready to terminate. And then sometimes we'll go ahead and mow it because the chickens can only be in one place at one time. So sometimes we'll go ahead and mow it and then tarp it, or sometimes we'll put the chickens on it and then tarp it. But the tarping typically always comes before planting, because again, in normal organic agriculture, the way you would deal with the weeds that have emerged, even the chickens leave some stuff, and usually you would come back through and disc that. Since we're not disking, the tarping kind of takes the place of the disking in terms of weed control and leaving you with a clean slate.
But the
and
compost.
we used to,
Yeah, no. I was saying the compost, not the tarping. I get that.
What about
the compost on?
The
When do you
compost,
put it
before
on?
we plant?
Right
Perfect.
before. Okay, so
Yeah,
you're
so
planting
tarp
into
comes
that
off.
compost. Okay, got
Yeah,
it.
tarp comes off, compost goes down, irrigation lines go down, and we plant. Yeah.
Excellent.
Got it. And how many chickens you said 5,000 square feet? How many chickens are on there?
Yeah, we have 120, and they're all layers. They're all female laying hens. We only do eggs out here. We don't do any broilers or anything.
Okay.
Yeah. So
now
to
let's talk.
answer,
Oh, go ahead.
are you going to
Maybe.
go ask about compost or?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously 2 inches of compost, on a 3 foot wide, 100-foot long bed all over the farm on 4 acres, that's a lot of compost. And so that's an expensive amount of compost as well. And so, our compost needs are at about 120 yards per year. We can get about 20 yards dropped off for $1,000 is kind of the commercial compost that we can buy. But this past year, with a grant through City of Austin, we were able to start our own on-farm composting project. And so the system that we're using is what's called an aerated aerated static pile system. So basically what that means is, static means that the pile doesn't move. So we don't actually turn these piles. And basically the material on the pile is on top of these perforated pipes, almost like you would see for a septic system. So big PVC pipes, like 4-inch pipes that have air holes coming out of them. And we have 2 of these kind of chained together. And then we just have a bouncy house pump, like you can get on Amazon for like $100. And we have that piped in to the pipes. And then that's on a timer. So every 30 minutes, the pump runs for 1 minute. And it forces air through those holes in the PVC. It forces that air up into the pile. Because essentially when you're turning a compost pile, you're just trying to introduce oxygen and kind of excite all the microbes in there and get them, kind of moving around and doing their thing. And you don't want the pile to become anaerobic, which is just like, if there's no oxygen kind of in the mix, it can get kind of slimy and funky, especially, if you have any kind of like fat or anything like that in it, that's more prone to becoming anaerobic. So we'll kind of build the piles and then we leave them there for a month. And with our organic certification, it has to be a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio. You have to start with a 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And we have a way we calculate that. And then it has to get up between 131 degrees and 170 degrees for 3 days in a row. And then the pile is considered ready to use in the field. And that's just what our organic certifier says, so we usually leave it cooking longer after it's reached that level, just because we're trying to really break it down and have it be like a nice finished material.
So what
are you feeding it?
Your materials?
Yeah, so part of the grant that we've done over the past year was we were able to go out and go to restaurants and pick up their compostables. So we were going to Lenoir restaurant down in South Austin and getting some of their stuff. We were going to Figure 8 coffee grounds, and also coffee chaff, like the roasting byproduct, are really nitrogen rich. And as long as you don't have your compost pile like just that, it's a really great addition to the compost pile. And then also we were going down to Fallen Oak Mycology down in Buda and getting their spent mushroom blocks. And that's kind of nice because we're just able to kind of go there whenever we want to. The hauling at the restaurants, like we replaced their usual hauler. So it was like, we had to do that, but the mushroom blocks, it was like, oh, they're just there. Come and get them, So those were really the 3 main inputs, as well as just veggie scraps from the farm. There's always like, if we clean a bunch of carrots because we're going to bulk them out or whatever, we have all these carrot tops that would go in. If we miss a day on harvesting squash and we end up with these giant squash that no one wants to eat, we'll throw them in there, that type of thing. We've also in the past gotten chicken litter from the chicken farmer here on our same piece of land. Whenever he started in his brooder, like a new round of broilers, we've taken his bedding from where he had his chicken brooder and added that to the piles. But I will say, sort of just a lesson in general with farming, we discovered that becoming a compost hauler on top of like a pretty high volume veggie producer, it doesn't work for us. Because basically it means that one of our managers has to be off farm for like 4 hours every week, which isn't a ton of time, but it's, we need him here. So that's one aspect of it that we realized, like, through the grant, luckily we were grant funded to like go do all of this, and his wages were covered, the gas was covered, that kind of thing. But we realized we don't want to be a waste hauler. We want to be a farm. We do want to produce our own compost, but we don't want to be running around town picking up food scraps. So we've recently gotten in touch with one of the bigger haulers in town and are working out a way that they would actually bring the material to the farm and tip it here, and we would have that for the piles. We would probably still go pick up the mushroom blocks ourselves like once every couple weeks, but that's a lot different than having to send someone out every single week. So I think, those kind of partnerships and recognizing your bandwidth and recognizing who else in the community is doing something that can contribute to a project and making those connections is really critical when you're like already a very busy farmer,
Exactly. You have to become a drop-off point. On Wednesday between 3 and 5, come drop off your food scraps or whatever and let them bring it to you. But yeah, that's really cool. What is your brown material that you use?
Yeah, we're lucky that we have a neighbor who has a tree trimming service, so he's
Oh,
dropping off
sweet.
chips whenever it's chipping
Brilliant.
season. We also have our own small farm scale chipper
Mm-hmm.
that we have to kind of trim from around here. But the mushroom blocks are an interesting one because I think they're almost like equal carbon and nitrogen ratio, because the blocks themselves, the medium is like sawdust. So I mean, I've seen people like kind of just let those break down and add that directly to their garden, like without any browns or greens, just the mushroom blocks.
Yeah.
So that kind of adds this neutral material that also has a really nice like texture to it, that kind of tilthy, sawdusty kind of texture. But yeah, so mostly wood chips and then the mushroom blocks. We don't have the best source for like dried leaves, but yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing so far.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I know you have a time constraint, so I want to talk about, how do we pay for this? What does it cost to be able to implement a resilient farm plan?
Yeah, and this is really, we're kind of taking a cue from the way that they've managed this in California. California has their own carbon credit system that the state actually collects carbon credits. And I don't know how it all works, but they have their own sort of like, enterprises through which they can purchase carbon credits, sell carbon credits on the carbon market. And they have this healthy soils program where, I guess it's their cap and trade proceeds technically, but they have this healthy soils program where the proceeds from that go into funding carbon farm plans and regenerative agriculture efforts. There's not a similar mechanism in Texas right now, but the model out there is pretty well built out. If there were some sort of revenue stream for Texas to be collecting money specifically for this purpose, the way that it gets administered after it kind of leaves the state level out in California is what's called the resource conservation districts, or RCDs. And the Marin County RCD was the first carbon farm plan like funder essentially and technical assistance provider for the first like 3 carbon farm plans that were out in Marin. So it really kind of grew out of state funding funneling down to the RCDs and then out to producers through Carbon Cycle Institute, which is a nonprofit that helped to actually write the plans. So in Texas, I don't know where that funding stream comes from, but we have soil and water conservation districts, which are similar organizations as the resource conservation districts. So, there's already kind of the structure in place to have some state funding behind these things. As far as the local level goes, our plan has been funded by City of Austin for the past 3 years, I guess. They've given us some money specifically for this project, and they also helped us build out our composting infrastructure. So local governments can also be a really big help. The NRCS practices that are embedded in the plan are also reimbursable through your county NRCS agency. On our scale, with all of our practices and everything, that's maybe about $800 a year. And our plan total for annual inputs, like leave all the tree planting and everything aside, but to just execute our plan, it's about $50,000 a year, so $800 a year for implementing these practices. It might buy some cover crop seed and stuff, but a farm of our scale is not going to fund our whole plan through the NRCS. So,
No, we buy cover crop seeds for 30 acres of land and are spending roughly $2,000 every time we do that. So, the $800 just feels like a nice little pat on the head. But so $50,000 to do this, how are y'all able to pull that off? So you've got City of Austin money, you've got the little bit of NRCS money. Where else does this come from?
Yeah, we have a few like corporate foundations that support, not just our regenerative agriculture work, but also like our refugee food access and livelihood work. That includes places like Patagonia. They're a really big funder in the regenerative ag space. Cliff Family Foundation, like Cliff Bar, I guess when they sold it or something, the family does a lot of philanthropic work around sustainable regenerative agriculture. We also have a few just private family foundations in the area. who I won't mention because I don't know if they want to be mentioned, but and then, we're just always writing grants. I mean, as a nonprofit, probably write, 4 or 5 grants a month, whether it's for like food access or, regenerative ag stuff. So we're always kind of on the lookout for those kinds of opportunities. And we kind of manage to cobble it together somehow every year. But I think that, one of our biggest funders over the past couple of years, and really what helped us launch the project, was funding through Travis County for refugee food access, and then also the community farmer program, because we were using these regenerative methods to help refugee families in need. We were able to kind of like have a decent amount of funding to start implementing some of these things with those funds. They were tied, the county money in particular was tied to pandemic relief. So we only had that for 2 years, and we knew we would only have that for 2 years. So now that that funding has gone away, we're having to get a little bit more scrappy and really try to like expand our partnerships, and then obviously just selling vegetables, I mean, we have to pay our staff and everything too. So a lot of this sort of extra regenerative bells and whistles, we have to kind of go beyond what we're able to pull in just from selling vegetables to implement a lot of this stuff.
Well, and I can see how a story and an organization like the Refugee Collective can find grant funding. You can find stuff that makes sense. You can find companies that are wanting to do some sort of philanthropic give back. Is this practical for family farms and ranches? Like, do you find, or do you have experience that a family operation can find these funds? Or is it you got to figure out a really good story before you apply for these grants?
Yeah, I mean, that's I feel like that's kind of a distinction just in especially the Austin area farming landscape. There's a lot of nonprofit farms and unfortunately a dwindling number of small family farms, doing vegetable production in particular. And I think that, there are grants that we're actually not a good fit for through the USDA. We've applied for grants through USDA as well as TDA, Texas Department of Agriculture, in the past, and they don't really want to work with like social missions like the USDA. And well, I shouldn't say that, but the USDA and TDA specifically, most of their funding, they want to see it benefiting small family farms. Probably what I would do if I were in that situation would be to team up with a university like Texas State has a good sustainable ag department, ACC, and go after some sort of research grant to where, you're testing like vegetable production in a like no-till system with compost application, and the research university could help to sort of define the outcomes that you're testing for, and then they would help do the testing, and the funding for that would all be written into the grant, and then the supplies to do this regenerative work could potentially, and maybe even labor depending on the grant, could come from that research grant. And then obviously that with grant funding, there's a lot of reporting and those sorts of things that go along, and farmers typically don't have time for that kind of thing. So I think, that would probably be the easiest path. It's not easy, but the most clear-cut path for small family farms would be through like a research grant through even Southern SARE does research grants for regenerative agriculture, Rodale, all these different organic agricultural organizations. But also, there's also family foundations that like to support small farms too, and that's just really like relationship building and, attending like at our Resilient Farm field day, there's going to be some of the people who fund us out there, coming by to check out, what their dollars have done. And, some of those people we met at other regenerative ag conferences. Like one person we met out at like the Force of Nature conference that they do out at Rome Ranch every year, out in Fredericksburg, and that was just me being at a conference and kind of chatting about what we do at the farm. And then, the guy got in touch with me a week later and wanted to help fund the work that we were doing, specifically around regenerative.
Put the work into networking. That's great.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. I think, it's going to take grant funding, state grant funding, philanthropic dollars, like these more established funding pathways like NRCS. I think it's going to take all of that until our subsidy system changes and we're not just pumping billions of dollars into people growing corn for gas, until those sorts of structural changes happen, I think it's going to take a lot more kind of coordination and like grassroots efforts to prove that this type of agriculture is better for the planet. It's better for, even just like water retention. It's better for our aquifers. It's better for, the people eating the food and the people working in these environments. I mean, across the board, it's really, in my view, the future of farming, and this resilient farm planning model can really be the structure that kind of drives that change.
And I think it so helps to be able to go and see for yourself. And so that's great that you guys put on this regenerative and resilient farm field day that's coming up on November 3rd. But you do have a few things coming up before that. A farm to table dinner fundraiser on October the 26th. Is that out at the farm?
Yeah. This is our second one. It's a really beautiful evening. Lenoir Restaurant, who we've partnered with on a lot of stuff, does the food. We're going to have live music this year. We're excited about that. And it's really a way to kind of have a delicious meal kind of in the environment where it was grown and learn about the organization. Last year was magical, and I got a good vibe heading into this year's event. So, yeah.
Outstanding. If people that are in the Central Texas area, if they want to participate, do they just go to your website, therefugeecollective.org?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think right now we have it kind of toward the top so people can find the tickets there.
Okay. And then next after that is the Resilient Farm webinar that is going to be preceding the field day. That's on October 28th. So if someone isn't in Central Texas and they can't come to the field day, is this webinar going to give them all that same information?
Yeah. It'll be kind of going over some of the stuff that we went over today, but I think I actually will be like presenting from the slide deck that we kept pulling up and I kept straying from. Sorry about that. But yeah, so it's going to be kind of laying out the process. But one of the cool things we're going to cover is the interactive map that we have. We have kind of like a Google My Map where you can kind of click around and see the different practices. So it is in that webinar, it will almost be like an aerial view of really, envisioning what the entire plan is, which that was something I didn't even realize we were going to come out of the planning process with. And I think as a producer, having this interactive thing to be like, oh, and then there's going to be an orchard here. And then this, it's like, it's kind of fun. So we'll go into a lot more in depth about the planning process and like what comes out of it at the end.
The field day, you still have tickets available? Is there still room? I know it's limited space.
Yeah. So it's in partnership with Travis County AgriLife Extension, and they're going to be providing lunch for everyone that day as well. And so we're trying to get like a cap of 50 people. And I want to say we're at like 35 tickets, not sold, but 35 people signed up because it's a free event. So yeah, we're at about 35 people signed up so far. So there's like 15 more spots left.
Okay. And yes, the webinar's free. The field day is free. And we met some really fantastic people at the field day that we participated in 2 years ago. So highly recommend.
Absolutely.
And if you have time for one more small little subject matter.
Yeah.
I know that you are on the food policy board in Travis County. Will you tell me a little bit about what that does? And then if people want to start something like that in their own county, that way we kind of know what's possible, what it does.
Yeah, like Caldwell County, huh? That would be great.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's the Austin Travis County Food Policy Board. So it's kind of not housed within, but sort of facilitated by the city of Austin. God, what are they called now? Austin Climate Action and Resilience Department. They used to be Office of Sustainability, but they've rebranded to Austin Climate Action and Resilience. And so they kind of facilitate these monthly meetings, and it's, all these stakeholders from different areas within the food sector in Austin and Travis County we have people who are more involved on the food access side. There is a representative from Central Texas Food Bank. My organization, Farm Share Austin, one of their folks is there. So, people from the farming sphere, the food access sphere. We have a nutritionist who's out at Lake Travis ISD. So, really like the whole gamut of people involved in the food system. There's 11 of us, and we come together, and the office from the city kind of facilitates basically leading us, kind of providing information and leading us toward writing recommendations for city council. So that's really like the group comes together specifically for that purpose, to write these recommendations, put them before city council, and then also put them before the Travis County Commissioners Court. There's 4 commissioners in Travis County. And so, we're working both within the city as well as the county level. So for instance, one that I've been working on lately has to do with farmland preservation and land access, because in every county and, Caldwell increasingly, all the farmland is getting bought up and developed. And if we don't act soon, that's just going to be the way it is. And then there really won't be much local agriculture going on anymore. There's kind of a window that feels like it's closing every month. I see a new farm that's been sold and a 7-Eleven's going up or whatever. So yeah, me and a few other people from the board formed a committee to draft this recommendation around, different mechanisms for farmland preservation. We bring that to the whole board, and then we all vote on that. And if everyone approves it, it gets put before city council and the commissioners court. And that's really just where the work begins. In Austin, at least, there's like 80 of these boards. Like there's like an arts board and a sustainability board and a this and a that and a parks and and all of these boards are writing these recommendations. So, all these city council members are getting these stacks of recommendations. So that's the next step, is we follow up with the city council people, set up meetings with them, maybe even go give a presentation at the commissioners court, that sort of thing, just to, really kind of get what we're thinking is important involved in the conversation more, with the ultimate goal of, actually getting some of what we think is important in like a future bond package, or maybe there would be, in the next city budget, there might be, some money earmarked for like a certain position at the city that could help with some of these goals.
So how do you start a food policy board? Who do you go to and say, hey, we want a food policy board in Caldwell County?
I think it would probably be best to visit with the city council folks and see what their structure is for boards and commissions, or the county commissioners court. I would think that there must be some committees in Caldwell County doing something. I'm not that familiar with the way the governance is structured. But yeah, I would think, there must be some mechanism for groups of citizens getting together to interface with the board that isn't just like open conversation at like city council meetings. So that's where I would start, would be to just say like, hey, we know there's this that exists in Austin, Travis County. Are there already other boards that exist here that serve a similar function to make these recommendations? And if so, we want to start a food one, and then I think it would just be kind of putting out an open call. I think the way that it works in Austin is that the whole council has to approve the members. So that's kind of another aspect of it. So kind of now that it's established up there, whenever someone's leaving the board, and it's usually like a 4-year term, I think, whenever someone's leaving the board will say like, oh, who should replace them? And they'll make a recommendation to city council, like, hey, we have this person who works in the food system. We think they would be a great replacement for this other person. That'll end up on the city council's desk for like, one of their meetings to vote on. Usually they trust the people on the board and they're like, yeah, that sounds great. And that's how people get brought onto the board.
Okay. Thank you for that little mini education in civic responsibility.
Yeah, I'm definitely still learning how the sausage is made. So it's a very complicated process I'm learning. But, I think it takes people, again, like putting the priorities out there and then following up and really being willing to put time into those conversations. That's kind of the only way. So, yeah.
100%. Well, Matt, thank you for joining us. Is there anything that we didn't ask you that's important to round out our conversation?
I don't think so. I think we kind of covered a lot of the practices and the planning framework, and I really encourage people to sign up for the field day. It's a really fun day and a great way, like y'all said, to meet people and just see who it is that's active in this space. And I just wanted to thank y'all for having me on. I love talking about this stuff, and I really, am always impressed by the work that y'all do. I feel like every time I see you, I find out about a new thing that you're involved in and kind of, promoting and stuff. So it's really awesome to have the community down there in Lockhart around soil health and farming. And yeah, just thank you for kind of providing this forum for people.
Well, thank you so much, and for educating folks and us, because that's what we're doing and trying to share that with other people. So we appreciate your work too. Thank you.